Hey guys, Chris from the Ultimate Recycler. We're going to look at some scrap metal again, in this particular case brass. I just thought I'd do a run through on brass for any beginner scrappers out there. One of my subscribers asked me to do one on brass. I know there's plenty out there on YouTube and everyone has their own take. So this is my take on brass for scrap metal. You can see here a bit of a range of stuff. Keys are most often made from brass. Plumbing fittings, ornamental pieces, light fittings, hardware, doorknobs, drawer knobs, and just general pipe and sheet brass and more larger plumbing fittings. So it's a very common metal and it actually pays quite well, and it's actually reasonably heavy. It's an alloy of copper and zinc. There are various forms of it, and also as far as scrap prices go, you need to be sure that it's brass and it needs to be pure. So let's look at identifying brass first, and then we'll look at the purity or the contaminations and what they mean to your price. Okay, so what tools are we going to use? Simply a magnet and a file. The magnet will sort out any ferrous stuff, and we'll just scan across these keys to show you how easy that is. The ring on those keys is steel and not brass. The keys will be brass, that's fine. And we have a steel key there, that's actually a suitcase key. So you can see how a magnet can give you some instant results regarding the any ferrous metals. It doesn't mean the rest of it is brass, so we'll look at, that's where we bring the file into it. But let's scan across the rest of it while I've got the magnet. That's fine, that's fine. So we can scan across the rest of these, and a quick scan. Here we go. These brackets, they look brass, but they're not. They're just brass plated. The world is full of trickery, and if you threw those in your brass bin and took them to the scrapyard, most likely they'd be spotted and they would downgrade your entire load. This one's not magnetic. These aren't. All good here. And this pipe is, and again it's just a look-alike. Looks like brass but it isn't. So both those ones would contaminate our load. So the magnet's handy for culling stuff easily, and we're not finished with it yet, but let's go to the file and we'll have a look at these keys here. So we'd obviously have to get that key ring off there, but any keys that look like brass will be brass. There won't be any issues there. You can also tell on some of them a bit of corrosion coming through, a bit of green verdigris, which is the copper component of the brass. So that was plated, but you can see the base metal underneath, so that would certainly be brass. No issues there. We can go on colour with the keys. However, these silver looking ones, you can get aluminium keys. I can tell by the weight of these that they're not, and with some experience you will learn very quickly that yes, they'll be fine, they will be brass. But the file is a good way of telling what's under the plating. One tip with an old file is use the edge. Invariably, no matter how much a file's been used, very rarely people actually use the edge. So the edge cutting, the cutter part of the file, you'll find is still very abrasive, and it does go through the plating really easily. So a quick file across there. I'll zoom the camera in and we'll see if we can see the yellow coming through the silver. So yep, definitely brass. So easy way to tell, and let's have a look at some of the plumbing fittings while I've zoomed in. This one's chromed, and if we cut across that, and you can feel the file really bite in, and you can hear it, and there you go, you should be able to see on that how nice and yellow that is underneath. So a lot of plumbing fittings are chromed, and I fold a little bit on the shower head as well, and you can see the yellow there as well. So the magnet test, these passed, and the file test showed yellow. Very confident that they're brass, no problems at all, and most plumbing fittings will be. This old tap Occasionally on these top sections they used a die cast pot metal, and again easy to check with the file. And there we go, we'll zoom in on that one, and definite yellow there. The reflection in this spot is not real flash. There you go, you can see that nicely. So that tap will be all brass, no problems at all. Now I do actually not sell some taps for scrap, because some of the old ones I actually sell quite well through the shop, and I'll touch on pricing in a minute, but we're just still identifying. Now this piece here that's been rather glary, it is a yellowy kind of hue, and it's going to be a bit hard to show the actual colour where I am, it's reflecting badly. But even though it looks a bit like brass, if we run the file across it, it's extremely soft. I can feel the file almost cut right into it. And if I can zoom in on that spot, you can see that that's actually not yellow, it's silver underneath. So whilst we had some pieces that didn't look like brass that were, we now have some pieces that do look like brass and they're not. So that one is actually aluminium and it's extremely light. So with a bit of experience you'll get to know that without even touching it with the file, but the file is good proof. The magnet proved that it wasn't ferrous, but as I said earlier, it doesn't prove that it is brass. So the file test showed that that's not brass. It's quite soft, it's very light. I know for certain that's aluminium. These other ones that we tested with the magnet, we've ruled them out from being brass. But even if I run the file across those as well, we're going to get that steel silvery look. So that fails both tests. So there you go, that's how you can sort a lot of your brass. We'll touch on this one here. This passed the magnet test. It is fairly light, so we don't conclusively know it's brass yet. So let's run the file across perhaps on this spot here. And you get a feel for the hardness. Now that actually, I don't know if you can tell from this light, but that actually is yellow, so that is brass. I'd suggest doing this outside. Inside sometimes it's a bit hard to tell the colour, and on the camera you're going to get a lot of reflection, but that's definitely brass. So that, and we know all these plumbing fittings will be. They pass the magnet test. General rule of thumb, if they're plumbing fittings and they're clearly metal, they're likely to be brass. But we'll do a quick check as well with the file, and that's very clear to see that that's yellow under there. Now I was saying with the hardness, you get a feel for how much drag is on the file, how soft the metal is, and it's worth your while practicing a little bit on some aluminium, which we know is soft, perhaps some copper, which I haven't actually got any copper here. Copper is very soft and you'll really feel the file cut in very easily. Brass is much harder than aluminium and copper, and then you could go to perhaps stainless steel or normal steel is a little bit harder again. And with a bit of experience you could almost pass a blind test by saying that feels like copper, that feels like brass. So it's just some more clues for you to identify it, and with a bit of experience you'll get much better at it. So all our plumbing fittings are brass. That light fitting was brass. They're all brass. The keys are all brass, except we've got to get that key ring off there because that would contaminate our load. Now with hardware, this handle looks brass. It passed the magnet test. We can do a quick file test here to check. It feels like brass on the file. It's yellow there, so that's brass as well. Most of your hardware would be. The old doorknobs are brass, but I do want to talk about that one in a tick. Now you do need to be careful with cast pieces, particularly older decorative pieces, because some of these will be brass and some won't. Like I said, the world's full of trickery, and here's where the file really does help, because these all pass the magnet test. So let's look at a few of these old drawer pulls. Now you'll find that the older ones, the early genuine ones, and I'm aware of what's old because it's my trade. All the early ones will be brass, and you can see by the back of that it looks brass. If we do the file test, it does show up yellow, and that's definitely brass. They all pass the magnet test. But these more modern reproduction handles, if I can zoom in on both of these and show you, there's some things to look out for. Where you see writing cast in it like that, and you see all these casting points, that's very typical of a die-cast zinc type material. This one's a good example as well. You can see some writing in there, these casting points, and I filed this one just before to have a look, and if we can zoom in on that, I'll try and file it a bit more. It's soft as well, and you can see that's silver. So whilst these look like brass, they're certainly intended to look like brass. They're actually not. These are a die-cast zinc or a pot metal. And the screw on that one was actually steel, and I should have passed the magnet over it a bit more thoroughly. So if they went in your brass bin, there's a fair chance your load would be contaminated and they would reduce the price. So you need to be a little bit clever on some of these. It's a matter of gaining experience. The older ones generally are brass. The newer ones quite often aren't, even though they look like brass. Now, that sorts those out. The doorknobs, as I said, the older ones are generally brass. Now this one presents an issue with contamination, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Now once you've sorted all your brass from your fake or look-alike brass, we've got to make sure it's pure. Now this one, this old doorknob, you'll see it's got an insert there, and if I check the magnet on it, that sticks. So the doorknob is brass, it passes the test, and the file shows that it's yellow, but it has a metal insert. So to sell that as brass and get a good price, you would need to get that steel out. If it's not an easy job, I'd suggest don't worry. It's a matter of economics, and I'll talk about that shortly. So I probably wouldn't bother trying to get that out there. I would throw that in a dirty brass bin. You get a lot less price, but you know, it's a matter of time spent, and we'll just demonstrate that now. Okay, I've got my trusty scales, or one of my trusty scales. I still like to use the old analog scales. So this doorknob, this contaminated doorknob, let's see what it weighs. Alright, so about 50 grams. Now the current price of brass, well at least before the coronavirus started impacting the world, the price of brass was a bit over $4 a kilo. So we'll work on 4. I have heard it actually got up to nearly 5 at one stage. But let's say $4 a kilo. This is 1/20th of a kilo. So 1/10 of a kilo would be 40 cents. This is 20 cents worth of brass if it was all pure. Now it's not. We know that that centerpiece is steel. It probably contributes a fair bit to the weight of it as well. So for 20 cents, well, all right, let's say 10 cents worth of brass, is it worth your while either grinding or filing or cutting with a hacksaw and trying to get that piece of steel out for 10 cents? In my books, no, but look, if you enjoy that sort of stuff, go for it. You know, people can sit down and spend 5 hours doing a jigsaw. That's 5 hours of their life, and they don't get any return other than satisfaction. So if you get satisfaction stripping all this stuff, absolutely fine by me. But it is important to be aware of the economics. So I would just throw that in the dirty brass bin, where you'll probably only get 50 cents a kilo instead of 4, but you haven't wasted time on it. With regards to weights, let's look at this door handle here. Now this one we identified as being brass. No issues there, it's nice and pure. No problems at all. Let's weigh it. We'll put it on these scales. And we've got just over 1/4 of a kilo. So let's say it's 1/4, and let's say brass was $4 a kilo. There's $1. So $1 for scrap. And I think it's important to keep these things in perspective. Now, that's a really nice door handle. I don't know that it's overly old. It may be 1970s, perhaps. Rough guess. But it's a nice, solid brass door handle for $1. Now, alright, admittedly I have a shop, and I would never put that in the brass bin. I would put that in the shop, and I'd probably put maybe a $10 price tag on it, because I could see someone wanting a nice old ornate, or oldish ornate brass door handle, maybe for an outdoor toilet, or you know, a bit of a nice door into the man's cave. So I see much better value in that than scrap brass. But admittedly, most of you don't have an outlet to sell things. It probably wouldn't be worth trying to eBay, because the postage would eat up any value you had. But you know, if you're having a garage sale, put it out for $5, put it out for $2. You're still doubling your price of the brass. But it's up to you. If you're just scrapping for the fun of it and want to cash brass in, go for your life. It's just important to be aware of those values. Now, just on the lines of weight, here's a big heavy piece of brass. This is an old trap from under a sink, and it passed the magnet test before, and it's passing the foil test. It's nice yellow brass. Sometimes these are actually copper. This one's a cast brass. Copper ones are obviously going to be worth a bit more. So let's weigh this and see what it works out, just to give you an idea of how brass can add up in value. I had to use my other scales for these, it weighs too much. So we're about 1¼ kilos, which would be for, say, $5. So there's a $5 piece of brass. You can see how it can add up to be a fair bit of money once you start picking it up. So that's a nice little piece. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is red brass or gunmetal. I've always known it as gunmetal. I know in the States and in Canada they refer to it as red brass. Mostly on older pieces. This is an old plumbing fitting. And I'm not sure how well the light's going to compare here, but you can see where I've filed it as compared to the yellow of brass. Oh, where's a good piece of colour combination? So it's got a pinkish sort of hue. And the reason is it's a much higher percentage of copper. And now I think red brass or gunmetal also might contain zinc in the alloy, but it is worth more, and it's worth separating if you're going to turn up some quantity of it. If you're not, well, it's not worth separating. You know, you wouldn't take just 2 pieces into the scrapyard. You might as well put it in with normal brass. Because it's got a higher percentage of copper in it, it's going to be better value. It won't contaminate your load of brass. But to give you an idea of larger pieces of that, a lot of the old plumbing fittings, and this, I actually found this along an old creek. Now this is the housing of a water pump, and it's heavy. It's very thick. It's quite an old piece, and it's pure. There's no metal bolts in it or anything. It's pure brass, or in fact, this is gunmetal. I'll grab my file and file a bit across the top here. And you can see there that's got more of a coppery tone to it. So that piece weighs 15 kilos. I'll tell you what, it got heavy carrying it back to my ute. So 15 kilos of gunmetal or red brass. A while back I probably would have got about $6 a kilo for that, or at least $5.50. But even at $5 by 15 kilos, there's $75. So you can see big pieces of brass are certainly worth grabbing. Okay, well, I think you'll hopefully got a bit out of all that. Feel free to ask any questions. If anyone isn't a beginner scrapper and wants to point out something I've forgotten to mention, by all means, put it in the comments. But hopefully that answers the questions my subscriber had about scrapping brass and where the value is and what you've got to look for and keeping it pure. So I'll do some more videos on scrap at some stage. I'll probably touch on copper and stainless steel and aluminium, all the common ones. So look out for them, and keep following my channel. It's much appreciated. Cheerio.